They didn't just fire Dineo, they dragged her across the marble floor and threw her out like trash. The accusation came fast. Loud final thief. No proof. No mercy. The gates slammed behind her as laughter echoed inside the mansion she once cleaned in silence. Her uniform was torn. Her dignity shattered, her voice unheard. Outside, the night swallowed her whole. But somewhere across Johannesburg, a man paused a surveillance video, rewound it, then leaned closer. Because what he saw wasn't theft. It was the beginning of something no one in that house was ready for. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? And if stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us until the end. Before the night, the gates closed on her. Before the word thief followed her like a shadow. She could not outrun Dineo's life. Had already been a long conversation with hardship, one she never raised her voice in, even when it broke her. She lived in a narrow, crumbling room at the edge of Alexandra Township, where the walls carried the stains of many seasons and the roof whispered every time the wind grew restless. The space was barely large enough for two thin mattresses, placed side by side. But to Dineo, it was home because it held the only person she had left in the world. Her younger brother, Thabo. Thabo was 16, but illness had stolen the strength from his body, long before life had a chance to give him dreams. His chest often rose in shallow, uneven breaths, and on colder nights he would cough until his whole body trembled. The clinic doctor had used words Dineo didn't fully understand: chronic respiratory condition, long-term treatment, consistent medication. But she understood one thing clearly: without medicine, Thabo would not survive. And medicine cost money. Money Dineo did not have. Every morning before the sun could fully stretch across the township, Dineo would wake quietly, careful not to disturb her brother. She would sit beside him for a moment, watching his face, making sure he was still breathing evenly. Sometimes she would reach out and gently adjust the thin blanket covering him, her fingers lingering just long enough to feel reassured. Then she would rise. Her routine never changed. A basin of cold water, a worn-out cloth, the same faded dress she washed every night and wore again every morning. A pair of shoes that had long since given up trying to protect her from the uneven ground beneath her feet. She never complained, not when the water was too cold, not when her stomach ached from hunger, not when her body begged her to rest, because none of that mattered as much as Thabo. Before leaving, she would always prepare something for him, even if it was just a small piece of bread or watered-down porridge. On better days, when she had managed to save a little extra, she would leave him with fruit. Those were rare days, precious days. Eat slowly, she would whisper, brushing his forehead gently. I'll bring your medicine tonight. Thabo always smiled at her like he believed her completely. That smile was both her strength and her burden, because every time she promised medicine, she was gambling with reality. The journey to Johannesburg was long and unforgiving. Dineo would walk part of the way, then squeeze into overcrowded taxis where people barely had space to breathe, let alone sit comfortably. The city rose before her like another world: glass buildings, polished streets, people who moved quickly and spoke with certainty. She did not belong there, but she worked there. The Moenas mansion stood behind tall gates and carefully trimmed hedges, its white walls gleaming under the sun as if they had never known dust. It was a place where everything was controlled, perfect, untouched by the kind of life Dineo came from. From the moment she stepped inside, she became invisible. Her work began before anyone acknowledged her presence. Floors had to shine, dishes had to disappear, clothes had to be pressed to perfection. Every corner of the house had to reflect wealth, and none of it could carry her name. Madame Zanele Mokoena rarely looked at her directly. When she did, it was with the kind of glance that measured worth and found none. "You're late," she would say, even on days Dineo arrived early. "Yes," Madame Dineo would reply softly, lowering her eyes. There was no point explaining, no point defending. Words did not change anything in that house. Naledi, Madame Zanelle's daughter, was different, but not kinder. Younger, sharper, always watching. She carried herself like someone who had never been told no. And it showed in the way she spoke, the way she laughed, the way she dismissed people like Dineo as if they were objects placed in her path for convenience. "Don't touch that," Naledi would snap sometimes. "Do you even know how much it costs?" Dineo would step back immediately. "I'm sorry." Sorry had become her most used word. Sorry for existing too loudly. Sorry for breathing in the wrong space. Sorry for not being invisible enough. But even in that house, even under that constant weight of quiet humiliation, Dineo held on to something no one could see. Her kindness. When the other staff whispered or complained, Dineo remained silent. When someone dropped something or made a mistake, she was the one who quietly fixed it without drawing attention. When food was wasted after large dinners, she would carefully pack small portions, never enough to be noticed, just enough to bring something back for Thabo. She never stole. She only saved what others had already thrown away. Every evening, after hours of labor that left her hands aching and her back stiff, Dineo would receive her pay, small, insufficient, but necessary, and every time she would do the same calculation in her head. Transport, food, medicine. There was never enough for all three. So she chose. Again and again. One evening, the choice became impossible to ignore. Thabo's cough had worsened the night before. He had struggled to breathe, his small body curling in on itself, as if trying to escape the pain inside his chest. Dineo had stayed awake beside him until dawn, her hand on his back, counting each breath like it might be the last. She knew he needed medicine. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. That day at work, her stomach remained empty. She had not eaten since the morning before. The smell of food in the kitchen twisted inside her, but she ignored it. Hunger was familiar. Hunger could be endured. But losing Thabo, that was something she could not survive. When her shift ended, she stood outside the small pharmacy near the taxi rank, her fingers tightly wrapped around the little money she had earned. It wasn't enough. She knew it before she even stepped inside. Still, she tried. "Please," she said quietly to the pharmacist. "Can I take half today? I'll bring the rest tomorrow." The man barely looked up. "We don't sell medicine like that. I'll pay, I promise. No money, no medicine." The words were simple, final. Dineo stood there for a moment longer, her hand slowly lowering. Around her, people came and went, buying what they needed, living lives where choices like this did not feel like punishment. She stepped outside again, the noise of the city rushing back around her. Her stomach tightened. Her chest felt heavy. She looked down at the money in her hand, then across the street at a small food stall where steam rose from freshly cooked meals. For a brief moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to eat, to feel full, to feel human. Then she closed her eyes and made her choice. She turned away from the food and walked back toward the road that led home, empty-handed, exhausted, but still moving, because somewhere in a small, dim room, Thabo was waiting for her. And no matter how much life took from her, she would keep going, even if it meant breaking quietly, piece by piece, where no one could see. The Moenas mansion was never truly quiet. Even in the early hours of the morning when the city outside still yawned awake, there was always something happening inside those walls, footsteps, echoing across polished floors, the distant hum of appliances, the low murmur of voices that carried authority without ever needing to rise. But on the day everything began to shift, the house felt different. Busier, sharper, as if it were preparing for something important. Dineo noticed it the moment she stepped through the gates. The air itself seemed heavier. "Move faster today," one of the senior house staff muttered as she passed, barely sparing her a glance. "Madam has guests tonight." Dineo nodded immediately. Yes, there were always guests. But something in the tone, the urgency, the tension told her this was not just another dinner. Inside the house was already alive with preparation. The dining table stretched long and gleaming, set with crystal glasses that caught the light like fragments of glass, frozen in time. Silverware was arranged with exact precision. Every detail had to reflect perfection. Because perfection was what Madame Zanelle demanded. And perfection in that house always came at someone else's expense. Dineo moved quietly between rooms, her hands working quickly, efficiently, invisibly. She polished surfaces, carried trays, adjusted curtains, wiped fingerprints that no one else would ever notice. Her presence was felt only when something wasn't done right. Not there. Madame Zanelle's voice cut through the air suddenly. Dineo froze. Mid-stepped the tray in her hands, trembling slightly. I'm sorry, madam. Zanelle stood near the dining table, her posture straight, her expression sharp as always. She didn't shout. She never needed to. Her disappointment carried more weight than anger. That arrangement is uneven. Do it again. Yes, madam. Dineo lowered her eyes and moved quickly to fix it. There was no room for mistakes. Not tonight. Naledi entered the room moments later, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. She wore a fitted dress that shimmered under the lights, her hair styled perfectly, her confidence effortless. She glanced at Dineo briefly, then smiled, but it wasn't kindness. Make sure you don't embarrass us tonight, Naledi said casually, picking up a glass and inspecting it. These people notice everything. Dineo nodded. I understand. Naledi tilted her head slightly, studying her for a moment longer. I doubt that. She placed the glass back down and walked away without another word. The room felt colder after she left. Dineo swallowed quietly and returned to her work. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than response. The guests began arriving, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep shades of orange and gold. Expensive cars rolled through the gates one after another, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Laughter followed. Voices layered over each other, smooth, confident, filled with the ease of people who had never had to question their place in the world. Dineo moved among them like a shadow, invisible, untouched. She carried trays of drinks, refilled glasses, cleared plates before anyone had to ask. Her movements were precise, careful, practiced to perfection. And yet, no matter how flawless she was, it was never enough. At one point, as she passed behind a group of guests, she caught a fragment of conversation. Where do they find these girls? A woman said, quietly, though not quietly enough. They always look so tired. A soft laugh followed. Dineo kept walking, her grip tightened slightly around the tray, but her face remained still, because reacting would only make things worse. Later in the kitchen, the atmosphere was no better. Be careful, one of the other workers whispered to her. Naledi is in a mood tonight. Dineo nodded faintly. Naledi was often in a mood. But tonight, it felt different, sharper, more deliberate, as if she were waiting for something. The dinner itself unfolded with perfect elegance on the surface. Guests complimented the food, admired the decor, praised Madame Zanelle's taste and success. Everything looked flawless. But beneath that surface, tension moved quietly, unseen. Dineo felt it in the way Naledi's eyes followed her movements, not constantly, but often enough to be noticed. In the way, Madame Zanelle's tone grew slightly colder with each passing hour. In the way, small mistakes, things that would normally be ignored, were suddenly corrected with precision. It was like standing on ground that felt steady, but wasn't. And then it happened. Dineo had just stepped into the main living area with a tray of drinks when Naledi's voice cut through the room. Wait. The word was soft, but it stopped everything. Dineo froze. Slowly, she turned. Yes, Ma'am Naledi stood near the center of the room. A small group of guests gathered around her. She held out her hand slightly, her expression thoughtful. Come here. Dineo hesitated for just a second, then stepped forward carefully. The room grew quieter. Not silent, but quieter. Enough for attention to shift. Naledi reached toward the tray, then paused. Her eyes moved over Dineo slowly as if seeing her clearly for the first time. What's your name again, Dineo? Naledi smiled faintly. Dineo. She repeated it like it was unfamiliar. Then suddenly she reached out not for a drink, but for the edge of Dineo's sleeve. The movement was unexpected. Dineo stiffened slightly. Naledi's fingers brushed against the worn fabric, lifting it just enough to expose the thinness of the material, the small tear near the seam. How long have you been wearing this? Naledi asked, her voice, light, almost amused. Dineo lowered her eyes. It's clean, ma'am. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone laughed softly. Naledi's smile widened just a little. That wasn't my question. Dineo swallowed. I don't have many clothes. The honesty slipped out before she could stop it. For a moment, Naledi said nothing. Then she laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Oh, she said, glancing at the others. Of course. The laughter spread. Not cruel in tone, but cruel in effect. Dineo felt the heat rise in her face. Her hands tightened around the tray, though she kept it steady. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, measuring, judging, reducing her to something less than human. Naledi let go of her sleeve and stepped back. You can go, she said lightly, already turning her attention elsewhere. Just like that, as if nothing had happened, as if Dineo had not just been turned into a moment of entertainment. Dineo stepped back slowly, then turned and walked away. Her pace remained even, her posture unchanged. But inside, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because humiliation, when repeated often enough, doesn't always break a person in visible ways. Sometimes it settles quietly, layer by layer, until it becomes something heavier than pain, something harder to carry. Back in the kitchen, Dineo placed the tray down carefully. Her hands trembled slightly now. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. One of the other workers glanced at her. Are you okay? Dineo nodded. I'm fine. She wasn't, but saying it out loud would not change anything, so she picked up another tray and returned to the room, because no matter how heavy the moment felt, her work was not done. And somewhere beyond those walls, in a small room that depended entirely on her, Thabo was still waiting. The night had not yet ended, but something inside it had already shifted. Dineo felt it before anything happened, not in a way she could explain, not something she could point to, but in the quiet spaces between movements, in the way conversations paused a little too long, in the way Naledi's eyes seemed to follow her just a second longer than necessary. It was the kind of feeling that lived beneath the surface, unspoken, unseen, but real. The dinner began to wind down, guests drifting from the dining table into the main living area, where soft music filled the air and laughter resumed, lighter now, more relaxed, touched with satisfaction. Dineo moved between them as she always did, clearing glasses, collecting plates, restoring order to a space that had been momentarily disrupted by celebration. Her body was tired, her feet ached, but her mind remained focused, careful, because in a place like this, carelessness had consequences. She stepped into Naledi's room, only briefly instructed to bring in a fresh set of glasses for a smaller group gathering there. The room was larger than the one Dineo shared with her brother, decorated with soft lighting, expensive fabrics, and shelves filled with items that existed purely for beauty, not necessity. She placed the tray gently on the table, then turned to leave. She did not touch anything else. She never did. That was one of the rules she followed without exception. Touch only what you are told to touch. See only what you are allowed to see. Exist only where you are permitted. She stepped out and closed the door quietly behind her. Minutes passed, then more. The house continued its rhythm. Voices, music, movement, until suddenly it broke. A sharp voice cut through everything. "Where is it?" The music stopped. The laughter faded. Footsteps echoed quickly across the floor. Dineo froze where she stood in the hallway, a tray still in her hands. Naletti's voice rose again, louder this time. "My bracelet. It was right here." A wave of tension spread through the house instantly. Guests began murmuring. Staff exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Madame Zanelle appeared almost immediately, her presence commanding attention without effort. "What happened?" she asked. Naletti stood near the center of the room, now her face no longer amused, but tight with something sharper anger. Yes, but something else, too. "It's gone," she said. "My diamond bracelet. It was on my dresser." Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable, the kind that demanded resolution. Madame Zanelle's gaze swept across the room slowly. "Everyone stay where you are." The authority in her voice left no room for argument. Dineo felt her chest tighten. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But something inside her began to sink. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she understood how this worked. The search began quickly. Staff were questioned, first quietly at first, then with growing sharpness. Guests were reassured, though their curiosity lingered just beneath the surface. Then came the instruction that changed everything. Check their belongings. The words were calm, controlled, but final. Dineo's breath caught slightly. One by one, the staff were asked to present their bags. Small things, simple things. Lives reduced to what could be carried in worn fabric and tired hands. Dineo watched as others went first. Some nervous, some confused, all uncomfortable. Nothing was found. Then yours. The word came from Madame Zanelle, directed at her. Dineo stepped forward slowly. Her bag was small, old, faded from years of use. It held everything she needed for the day and nothing more. She hesitated for just a moment, then handed it over. Madame Zanelle didn't take it herself. She gestured to one of the security staff instead. "Open it." Dineo's fingers curled slightly at her sides. Her heart began to pound. Not because she feared being caught, but because she feared being chosen. The zipper slid open, slow, loud. Every sound in the room seemed to pause. The guard reached inside, pulled out a folded cloth, a small container. Then he stopped. His hand remained inside the bag for a second longer. Then slowly, he pulled something out. A glint of light caught immediately. Sharp, unmistakable. The bracelet. Naletti's diamond bracelet. The room shifted instantly. Gasps, whispers, the weight of judgment settling all at once. Dineo stared at it. Her mind went completely still. "No," she whispered. The word barely left her lips. Madame Zanelle's expression hardened. "So," she said quietly, "it was you." Dineo shook her head immediately. "No, madam, I didn't enough." The interruption was swift, cold. "I trusted you in this house." Dineo's voice trembled now. "I didn't take it. I don't know how it got there." Naletti stepped forward slowly. Her expression had changed again. No longer amused, no longer sharp. Now disappointed, controlled, almost convincing. "I left it in my room," she said. "And you were in there." Dineo's breath caught. "I only brought the tray, and now it's in your bag." The logic was simple, clean, impossible to argue against in that moment. The room had already decided. Dineo looked around desperately, instinctively searching for something. A face, a doubt, a pause, anything. But all she saw were eyes, watching, judging, closing. "I didn't steal it," she said again, her voice breaking now. "Please, I wouldn't." Madame Zanella raised her hand slightly. Silence followed immediately. "I will not have a thief in my home." The words landed like final judgment. Dineo felt something inside her collapse, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. "I take her out." The command was given before she could finish. 2 security men stepped forward. Dineo stepped back instinctively. "Please, please listen to me," she said, her voice rising now, desperation finally breaking through the silence she had held for so long. "I didn't do this. I swear I didn't." Her words dissolved into the air. Unheard, unwanted. One of the guards took her arm, firm, unyielding. "Please, my brother." She tried again, but it didn't matter. Nothing she said mattered, because in that moment, truth had no weight. Only accusation did. The bracelet gleamed under the lights. Proof, even if it wasn't. Dineo was pulled toward the door, her feet struggling to keep pace, her voice breaking as she tried one last time. "Madam, please." But Madame Zanella had already turned away. Naledi stood still, watching, silent. And then the door opened. Cold air rushed in, and just like that, Dineo was no longer part of the house. Not a worker, not a person, just a problem that had been removed. Behind her, the door closed. The sound echoed louder than anything else that night, and inside that silence, the truth remained. Hidden, for now. The night did not welcome Dineo. It swallowed her. The moment the gates slammed shut behind her, the world on the other side felt colder than it had any right to be. The mansion stood tall and untouched, its lights glowing warmly, its laughter slowly returning as if nothing had happened, as if she had never existed inside those walls. But outside, there was no warmth, no light, no place for her to stand. Dineo staggered forward, her breath uneven, her chest tight with something that refused to settle. The security guards had not been gentle. Her arm still throbbed where one of them had gripped her too tightly, and her dress already worn now hung loosely where the fabric had torn. She didn't cry immediately. The shock came first. A hollow silence that filled her head, making everything feel distant, unreal. The word thief echoed in her mind over and over again, louder than the sound of the gate, louder than the voices she had tried to reach. She had said the truth. She had begged. And still, no one had listened. Dineo took a few more steps away from the gate before her legs gave in. She sank to the ground slowly, as if her body had simply decided it could not carry the weight anymore. The road was quiet at that hour. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping over her briefly before disappearing again. No one stopped. No one asked. Why would they? She was just another figure on the side of the road, another story no one wanted to hear. The rain began without warning, soft at first, then heavier, cold drops hitting her skin, soaking through her clothes, washing over the dust and shame that clung to her but not strong enough to take it away. Dineo wrapped her arms around herself, her body trembling, not just from the cold, but from everything that had just been taken from her in a matter of minutes. Her job, her income, her dignity, her voice, and most of all, her ability to care for Thabo. That thought hit harder than anything else. Her eyes opened suddenly. Thabo. He was waiting. He didn't know what had happened. He didn't know she had lost everything. He didn't know there would be no medicine tonight. Dineo pushed herself up, her movements, unsteady at first, then more urgent. She couldn't stay there. She couldn't break. Not yet. Not when someone was depending on her. The journey back felt longer than it ever had before. The taxi drivers barely looked at her. One refused to take her because she didn't have enough money for the full fare. Another let her in, only after she promised to pay the rest another day. She sat in silence, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, her eyes fixed on nothing. The city lights blurred past her. Beautiful, distant, unreachable. When she finally stepped back into the township, the rain had slowed, but the cold remained. The ground was muddy, the air thick. The narrow paths between homes were darker than usual shadows, stretching in every direction. Dineo moved quickly, now her heart pounding harder with every step. Please let him be okay. Please. She reached the door of their small room and pushed it open. Thabo. Her voice was soft, careful. Inside the room was dim lit only by the faint glow of a small lamp. Thabo lay on the mattress, curled slightly on his side. For a moment he didn't move. Dineo's heart dropped. She rushed to his side, immediately kneeling beside him. Thabo. He stirred slightly at the sound of her voice, his eyes opening slowly. You're back, he whispered. Relief flooded through her so quickly it almost made her dizzy. Yes. I'm here. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his forehead. Too warm. Her stomach tightened. Did you eat? She asked. He nodded faintly. A little. His voice was weak, tired. Dineo swallowed. I'm sorry I'm late. He shook his head slightly. It's okay. He paused, then looked at her more carefully. You're wet. She forced a small smile. It rained. He frowned slightly as if trying to understand something deeper than what she had said. Then quietly, Did you bring the medicine? The question hung in the air. Heavy, unavoidable. Dineo felt her chest tighten. For a moment she couldn't speak. She had prepared herself for everything else, the cold, the hunger, the humiliation. But not this. Not his trust. Not the way he looked at her. Like she would always find a way. She began. Her voice faltered. She looked down briefly, then back at him. I couldn't get it today. The words felt like failure. Thabo didn't respond immediately. He just nodded slowly. Okay. No anger, no disappointment, just acceptance. That made it worse. Dineo's throat tightened. I'll try again tomorrow, she said quickly. I promise. Thabo gave a small smile. I know you will. He closed his eyes again, his breathing uneven. Dineo stayed beside him, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't allow herself to think too far ahead. Because if she did, if she allowed herself to truly understand what had happened tonight, she might not be able to stand back up. Hours passed. The room grew colder, the night deeper. Dineo hadn't eaten. She hadn't changed out of her wet clothes. She hadn't rested. But none of that mattered. She sat there listening to Thabo's breathing, counting each rise and fall of his chest, like she had done so many times before. Only now, each breath felt more fragile, more uncertain. Because tonight something had changed. Not just outside, inside. In the fragile balance she had been holding together for so long. Her job was gone, and with it, their only stability. Morning would come. It always did, but for the first time in a long time. Dineo didn't know what it would bring. She didn't know how she would fix this. She didn't know how she would protect him. All she knew was this. She could not give up. Not when everything depended on her continuing, even if she had nothing left to stand on. Dineo leaned her head back against the wall, slowly her eyes closing just for a moment. Not to rest, just to breathe. And in that quiet, fragile space between exhaustion and fear, she made a silent decision. No matter what it took, no matter how far she had to fall, she would find a way. Because losing everything was not the same as losing hope. Not yet. Mourning did not bring relief. It only revealed more clearly what the night had taken. Dineo woke before the sun fully rose, not because she had rested, but because her body refused to sink any deeper into exhaustion. Her back ached from leaning against the wall, her clothes still damp from the rain clinging uncomfortably to her skin. For a moment she didn't move. She just listened. Thabo's breathing, uneven, soft, still there. She opened her eyes slowly and turned toward him. He was awake, watching her. "You didn't sleep," he said quietly. Dineo forced a small smile. "I did. Just not for long." He studied her face for a moment as if searching for something she wasn't saying. But he didn't press. He never did. "Are you going to work today?" he asked. The question landed gently, but it cut deep. Dineo hesitated, only for a second. "Yes," she said. The lie came softly, carefully, because the truth would do nothing but add weight to a body already struggling to carry enough. Thabo nodded. "Okay." He coughed lightly, turning his face away as if trying to hide it. But Dineo saw. She always saw. "I'll bring your medicine today," she added quickly, standing up before he could ask more. He smiled faintly. "I know." Those two words followed her as she stepped outside. "I know." Not doubt, not fear, trust, and that made everything heavier. The township was already awake. Voices rising in familiar patterns, people moving through narrow paths with purpose, carrying buckets, bags, responsibilities. Life didn't stop here, not for pain, not for loss. Dineo walked without direction at first. Her feet moved automatically, following a path she had taken so many times before. But today, there was nowhere waiting for her at the end of it. No job, no income, no solution. Only the same question, repeating in her mind. What now? She tried the places she knew first. Small homes where she had once heard someone mention needing help. A nearby shop where she asked if they needed someone to clean or assist. Each answer came quickly. "No, we're not hiring. Try somewhere else." Some didn't even respond. They just looked at her, then turned away. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down onto the streets, making the dust rise with every step. Dineo's stomach tightened painfully, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the day before. But hunger was familiar. She ignored it. She had to, because there was something more urgent than hunger. Money, medicine, time. By midday her steps had slowed, her energy drained, but she kept moving. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the truth she wasn't ready to accept. She reached the edge of a busier road where small vendors lined the street selling food, fruit, anything they could manage. The smell hit her immediately, warm, rich, alive. Her stomach twisted. She paused, just for a moment, watching. People stepped forward, exchanged coins, received food. Simple, easy, normal, something she had not experienced in a long time. Her hand moved slowly to her pocket. Empty. She knew it before she checked. Still, she checked. Nothing. Dineo exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering just a second longer before she turned away. But as she did, she noticed something. A small figure sitting a short distance away from the stall. An elderly woman. Her back slightly bent, her clothes worn thin, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She wasn't asking for anything, not calling out, not reaching, just sitting quietly, watching the same food Dineo had just turned away from. For a moment, Dineo hesitated. Then something inside her shifted. Not logic, not reason, something deeper. She looked back at the stall, then at the woman, then back again. Her feet moved before her mind could argue. "Excuse me," she said softly to the vendor. He barely looked up. "Yes, can I pay later?" He shook his head immediately. "No credit. I just need something small." "No." The answer didn't change. It never did. Dineo nodded slowly. She stepped back, her chest tightening again. But then, her eyes fell on something near the side of the stall. A small container. Leftover pieces. Food that had been set aside, likely to be thrown away. She looked at the vendor again. That one. Can I take it? He followed her gaze, then shrugged. It's nothing. That's okay. He waved his hand dismissively. Take it. Dineo picked up the container, carefully holding it like it mattered, because to her it did. She turned and walked toward the elderly woman. The woman looked up as she approached, her eyes cautious, uncertain. Dineo knelt slightly, offering the container. You can have this. The woman blinked. Are you sure? Dineo nodded. Yes. The woman hesitated, then slowly reached out and took it. Thank you, she said softly. Dineo smiled faintly. It's okay. She stood up again, stepping back, her stomach still empty, her body still tired, her situation unchanged. But something inside her felt lighter. Not because her problems had disappeared, but because even in that moment she had chosen not to become hard. The woman opened the container slowly, her hands shaking slightly. Dineo turned away, beginning to walk again, but she didn't get far. Wait! The voice stopped her. She turned back. The elderly woman was looking at her now, not just with gratitude, but with something else, something deeper. What's your name? She asked. Dineo. The woman nodded slowly. Dineo. She repeated it, carefully as if committing it to memory. Then she smiled. A small, knowing smile. Kindness like yours doesn't go unseen. Dineo didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded. Take care, she said, then turned and continued walking. The words stayed with her. Not as a promise, not as hope, just something to hold on to. Because right now she had very little else. The sun had begun to lower slightly by the time her steps brought her back toward the direction of home. She had no job, no money, no medicine, nothing she could place in Thabo's hands except the same promise she had already broken once. Her chest tightened again at the thought, but she kept walking, because there was no other choice. And somewhere behind her, unseen, the elderly woman watched her go, her eyes no longer tired, no longer uncertain, but thoughtful, as if she had just witnessed something rare, something important, something worth remembering, and perhaps something worth acting on. By the time the sun dipped low over Johannesburg, the city had begun to glow in a different way. Not softer, just more honest. The noise of the day gave way to something quieter, something that revealed what people carried when they were no longer surrounded by crowds. Dineo felt it as she walked, every step heavier than the last. Her body was tired in a way that no amount of rest could fix. Hunger gnawed at her, dull but persistent. Her mind replayed the same thoughts over and over again. Where to find work, how to get money, how to keep Thabo alive one more day. And beneath all of it, the memory of the night before, the accusation, the humiliation, the way no one had listened. She tried to push it away, but it lingered, because some wounds didn't disappear just because you kept moving. They followed, quietly, constantly. The township came into view again, familiar, and worn its narrow paths, winding between homes that leaned into each other, like they were holding themselves up. Dineo slowed slightly. She wasn't ready to step back inside. Not yet, because inside, there would be questions, and she still didn't have answers. She paused near a small roadside area where a few people gathered around a dimly lit stall. The air carried the scent of grilled meat and spices, laughter rising and falling in bursts. Normal life, unbothered, unaware. Dineo stood at the edge for a moment, watching, then turned away. She couldn't afford to stand still. She had to keep moving, but as she stepped forward, a voice stopped her. Dineo. She froze. Her name, spoken clearly, not guessed, not asked, known. Slowly she turned. A man stood a few steps behind her. He wasn't dressed like the people in the township. His clothes were simple but not worn, clean, well-fitted. His posture, calm, his presence steady in a way that didn't demand attention, but held it anyway. Dineo frowned slightly. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The man shook his head. "No." His voice was low-measured. "But I know you." A small tension tightened in Dineo's chest. She took a step back instinctively. How he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her for a moment, not in a way that felt invasive, but careful. Observing, understanding. "I saw you earlier today," he said finally. "Where near the food stall." Dineo's expression shifted slightly. The memory surfaced quickly. The elderly woman, the container of food, the quiet exchange. "You gave away what you needed," the man continued. Dineo looked down briefly. "It wasn't much. It was everything you had." The statement wasn't dramatic, just true. She didn't respond, because there was nothing to argue. The man took a step closer, but slowly, deliberately leaving space for her to move if she needed to. "My name is Kagiso," he said. Dineo nodded faintly. "Okay." She waited, uncertain. People didn't approach her like this, not without reason. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. The question wasn't rude, just cautious. Kagiso's expression didn't change. "I want to help you." Dineo almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because she had heard something like that before. Promises, offers, words that didn't always mean what they sounded like. "I'm fine," she said. The lie came easily now. Too easily. Kagiso tilted his head slightly. "No," he said. "You're not." The directness caught her off guard. Her eyes lifted to meet his for the first time. There was no pity there, no judgment, just clarity. It made her uncomfortable. "I don't need help," she said again, more firmly this time. Kagiso didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, then held it out toward her. "If you change your mind," he said. Dineo didn't take it immediately. She looked at the card, then at him, then back again. "What is this? My contact. And why would I call you? Because you're running out of options." The truth of it landed harder than she expected. Her jaw tightened slightly. "I'll figure something out." Kagiso nodded. "I believe you will." He paused, then added, "But you don't have to do it alone." The words settled between them, quiet, heavy. Dineo hesitated. Her hand moved slowly, then stopped. Trust wasn't something she could give easily. Not anymore. "I don't know you," she said. Kagiso nodded again. "That's fair." He didn't withdraw the card. He didn't insist. He simply waited, giving her the choice, something she hadn't had much of lately. Dineo looked at the card one more time. Then slowly, she took it. Her fingers brushed his briefly, warm, steady. She pulled her hand back quickly. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter now. Kagiso gave a small nod. "That's all." He stepped back slightly, creating distance again. "I won't force anything," he said. "The choice is yours." Dineo held the card tightly. She didn't look at it yet. She didn't want to, because looking would make it real. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. The question slipped out before she could stop it. Kagiso considered it for a moment. Then, "Because you didn't become cruel when life gave you every reason to." Dineo's breath caught slightly. She didn't respond, because she didn't know how. Kagiso gave her one last look, then turned and walked away. Just like that. No pressure, no expectation, no demand. Dineo stood there watching him go until he disappeared into the evening shadows. Only then did she look down at the card in her hand. A name. A number, nothing more. Simple, but somehow heavy. She slipped it into her pocket slowly, then turned toward home. Her steps were still tired, her body still weak, her problems unchanged. But something inside her had shifted. Not hope, not yet, but possibility. And sometimes that was enough to take one more step forward. When she reached the door, she paused briefly, her hand resting against the worn wood. Inside, Thabo was waiting. Inside, reality remained. But now there was something else. A choice. A fragile one, but real. Dineo took a breath, then opened the door and stepped inside. The night inside the small room felt heavier than usual. Not because anything had changed physically. The same cracked walls, the same dim light, the same thin mattress where Thabo lay, but because Dineo carried something new with her. A possibility. Small, fragile, uncertain, but present. She closed the door, gently behind her, and stepped inside, her movements quieter than usual, as if she were afraid of disturbing something invisible in the air. Dineo Thabo's voice came softly from the mattress. "I'm here," she replied, moving quickly to his side. He shifted slightly, trying to sit up, but she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't. Just rest." He nodded, though his breathing still carried that familiar strain. "You're late again," he said, not accusing, just noticing. Dineo offered a faint smile. "I had to look for something." That part was true. She had spent the entire day searching, for work, for answers, for a way forward. "Did you find it?" Thabo asked. The question lingered between them. Dineo hesitated, then slowly, "Maybe." Thabo studied her face carefully. "You always say that when you're not sure." She let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. "You know me too well." He smiled faintly. "You're all I have." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Dineo reached out, brushing his hair gently away from his forehead. "And you're all I have too." Silence followed. Not empty, just shared. After a moment, she stood up and moved toward the small corner where their few belongings were kept. She poured some water into a cup and brought it back to him. "Drink slowly." He obeyed without argument. Then, as he settled back down, his eyes drifted toward her again. "You didn't go to work today, did you?" The question came quietly, but it landed clearly. Dineo froze for a fraction of a second. She had hoped to avoid this, to carry the truth alone a little longer. But Thabo, he saw more than she wanted him to. "No," she said finally. He didn't look surprised. What happened? Dineo sat down beside him again, her hands resting loosely in her lap. For a moment she didn't speak, not because she didn't know what to say, but because saying it would make it real. "They said I stole something," she said quietly. Thabo's eyes widened slightly. "You?" She nodded. "I didn't, but it didn't matter." He pushed himself up slightly, despite her earlier protest. "That's not fair." Dineo gave a small, tired smile. "No, it's not." Silence stretched again, this time heavier. "What are we going to do?" Thabo asked. There it was, the question she had been avoiding all day, the one without a clear answer. Dineo looked down briefly, then reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the card. She pulled it out slowly, turning it over once before looking at it again. A name, Kagiso Dlamini. A number, nothing more. But somehow it felt like more. "A man gave me this," she said. Thabo leaned slightly to see. "Who is he?" "I don't know." "You took it anyway." Dineo nodded. "I didn't want to, but I didn't want to lose the chance either." Thabo studied the card, then looked back at her. "Do you trust him?" The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Dineo shook her head slightly. "I don't know him." "Then why are you thinking about it?" She exhaled slowly. Because I don't have anything else. The honesty settled between them. Thabo didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her. Then sometimes he said softly, "Help doesn't come from people we know." Dineo's eyes lifted to meet his. He gave a small shrug. "I mean, you always help people you don't know." She blinked. The memory of the elderly woman surfaced again. The container of food. The quiet exchange. Dineo looked down at the card again. Her fingers tightened slightly around it. "What if it's a mistake?" she asked. Thabo didn't hesitate. "Then we'll deal with it." His voice was weak, but steady. "What if it's not?" he added. The question lingered. Different this time. Not heavy, not painful, just open. Dineo leaned back slightly, her head resting against the wall. Her mind moved quickly now, replaying everything: Kagiso's voice, his calm presence, the way he didn't push, didn't demand, didn't treat her like she owed him anything. It didn't feel like a trap. But she had learned not to trust feelings alone. Still, she was running out of time. Thabo's condition was getting worse. She had no job, no income, no immediate solution. Only this small, uncertain connection. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I'll call him," she said. Thabo smiled faintly. "I think you should." Dineo looked at the card one more time, then reached for the small old phone they shared. Her fingers hesitated over the buttons, just for a moment. Then she dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Her heart beat louder with each second. Then hello, Kagiso's voice, calm, recognizable. Dineo swallowed. "It's Dineo." There was no pause, no confusion. "I was hoping you would call," he said. Something in her chest shifted slightly. "I don't know if this is a good idea," she admitted. "Neither do I," Kagiso replied honestly. That caught her off guard. "But I think it's worth trying," he added. Dineo glanced at Thabo briefly. He watched her quietly. Trusting. Waiting. "I need help," she said finally. The words were not easy, but they were necessary. "What kind?" Kagiso asked. "Medical. For my brother." There was a brief pause on the other end. Not hesitation. Consideration. "I can help with that," he said. Dineo's grip tightened on the phone, and in return she asked quickly. The question came instinctively. Because nothing came without a cost. Kagiso's answer came just as calmly as before. "Nothing." Dineo frowned slightly. "That's not how this works." "It can be," he said. She shook her head even though he couldn't see her. "No one helps for nothing." Kagiso's voice softened slightly. "Then consider it this," he said. "You helped someone today when you had nothing. Let me do the same." Dineo fell silent. Her eyes moved to Thabo again. He was watching her carefully, hope beginning to form where exhaustion had lived before. "Where are you?" Kagiso asked. She gave him the location. "I'll come now," he said. Dineo blinked. "Now, yes. It's late. That doesn't matter." The certainty in his voice left little room for argument. Dineo hesitated. Then, "Okay." The call ended. The room felt different again. Not lighter, but changing. Thabo shifted slightly, trying to sit up more. "Is he coming?" Dineo nodded. "He said he will." Thabo smiled. "A real one this time." "Then maybe. Things are going to be okay." Dineo looked at him. Really looked. At the way hope had returned so easily to his face. At the way he still believed. Despite everything, she wasn't sure she could believe that yet. But for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she allowed herself to think it. Maybe. Just maybe. Things could change. When Kagiso arrived, he did not come with noise. There were no flashing lights, no long convoy of expensive cars announcing his presence. No urgency that demanded attention from the outside world. Instead, his arrival felt almost out of place in the quiet, worn-out street, where Dineo lived as if something from a different reality had stepped into a space that had never expected it. The car that stopped a few meters from her door was clean, understated, and silent. Not new enough to attract curiosity, not old enough to blend into neglect. It was the kind of balance that only someone intentional would choose, someone who understood how to exist without being seen too quickly. Dineo noticed it immediately, not because it was extravagant, but because it didn't belong. She had been standing just outside the door, her arms folded tightly against her chest as if holding herself together when the car came to a stop. Her heart began to beat faster, not from excitement but from uncertainty, because now the possibility she had agreed to over the phone had become real, and reality always carried consequences. The driver's door opened slowly. Kagiso stepped out. He looked exactly the same as before, calm, composed, unhurried. But something about him felt different now that he stood in her world instead of calling from a distance. There was a quiet authority in the way he moved, in the way he looked around briefly, taking in everything without judgment, without surprise. As if he had seen places like this before. As if he understood them. Dineo didn't move toward him immediately. She waited, watching, measuring, because trust once broken did not return easily. Kagiso approached her, slowly stopping a few steps away, leaving enough space for her to breathe, to choose to step back if she needed to. "You called," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle. Dineo nodded. "I wasn't sure I should." "But you did." "Yes." There was no need to explain further. Both of them understood what that meant. A choice made not out of comfort, but necessity. Kagiso glanced briefly toward the small structure behind her. "Is your brother inside?" Dineo hesitated, then nodded again. "He's not well," I know, Kagiso said quietly. That made her pause. "You know, I asked a few questions. The answer was simple, but it carried weight." Dineo's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in caution. "You investigated me." Kagiso met her gaze without flinching. "I made sure you were telling the truth." There was no apology in his tone. Just honesty. Dineo held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. She didn't like that, but she understood it. Because in her world, trust was fragile, and in his, it was probably rare. "Come," she said finally, stepping aside slightly. Kagiso followed her inside. The moment he crossed the doorway, the difference between his world and hers became undeniable. The room was small, worn, and barely held together by effort alone. There was no space for luxury here, no room for excess, only survival. Thabo lay on the mattress, his body still, his breathing uneven but present. His eyes opened slightly as they entered. "Dineo, I'm here," she said softly, moving quickly to his side. He noticed Kagiso immediately. His expression shifted, curiosity, confusion, a hint of caution. "Who is that?" Dineo hesitated for just a second. "Someone who wants to help." Thabo looked at Kagiso again, studying him more carefully. Kagiso stepped forward slowly, crouching slightly to bring himself to Thabo's level, rather than standing over him. "My name is Kagiso," he said, "and I heard you've been stronger than most people twice your age." Thabo blinked, then gave a faint, tired smile. "I don't feel strong." Kagiso's expression softened just slightly. "That's usually how it works." The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Kagiso reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling a doctor," he said. Dineo's head snapped up. "Now, yes, that's not necessary." "It is," he interrupted gently, not harshly, but with certainty. Dineo opened her mouth to argue, then stopped, because deep down she knew he was right. She stepped back slowly, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from something unfamiliar. Relief. Kagiso spoke calmly into the phone. his tone changing just enough to reveal something beneath the surface, something more structured, more commanding, more accustomed to being listened to. "I need immediate assistance," he said. "Private." "Yes, I'll send the location." He ended the call, then looked at Dineo. "They'll be here soon." Dineo swallowed. "You didn't ask how much it costs." Kagiso shook his head. "It doesn't matter." Her voice dropped slightly. "It matters to me." Kagiso studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then we'll talk about that later." The answer wasn't dismissive. It was deferred, respectful. Dineo exhaled slowly. She didn't fully understand this man, but she was beginning to realize something important. He wasn't like the others. Minutes passed. Then the sound of another vehicle approached, quieter, controlled, deliberate. A doctor arrived, not from a public clinic, not someone overwhelmed or rushing, but someone prepared, equipped, focused. The examination began immediately. Dineo stood to the side, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on every movement, every expression, every word exchanged. Thabo remained calm, though his breathing grew more noticeable as he was examined. "What is it?" Dineo asked, finally, unable to hold back any longer. The doctor looked at her. He should have been treated properly weeks ago. Her heart dropped. "I tried. I know," the doctor said gently. "But right now we focus on what we can still do. Still do, not what had already been lost." Kagiso stepped slightly closer. "What does he need?" The doctor listed it calmly. Medication, consistent monitoring, possibly a transfer to a better-equipped facility if his condition didn't stabilize. None of it sounded simple. None of it sounded cheap. Dineo felt the weight of it immediately. But Kagiso didn't react the same way. "Arrange everything he said." The doctor nodded. "It will be done." And just like that, what had felt impossible hours ago began to move. Dineo stared at him, not speaking, not questioning, just trying to understand. Because in her world, problems like this didn't get solved with a single sentence. They lingered, they stretched, they broke people, but here they shifted, quickly, quietly, effectively. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. Kagiso looked at her. For a moment he didn't answer. Then, "Because you would have done the same." Dineo shook her head slightly. "I don't have what you have." "No," he said, "but you gave what you had anyway." The words settled deeply. Because they were true, and because no one had ever said something like that to her before. The doctor finished preparing the initial treatment. Thabo's breathing began to ease slightly. Not fully, but enough. Enough to feel the difference. Enough to bring something back into the room that had been missing. Hope, real, fragile, but present. Dineo sat beside him again, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For the first time in days, her shoulders lowered, her breath steadied, her mind quieted. Not completely, but enough. She looked up at Kagiso, still standing there, still calm, still watching, not with control, not with ownership, but with quiet understanding. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something close, something beginning. Because sometimes change doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand belief. It simply steps into your life and starts rewriting what you thought was possible. The night did not end the way Dineo had expected. For so long, her life had followed a pattern she understood, pain that stretched without interruption, effort that rarely led to relief, hope that came in small, fragile pieces, only to disappear again before she could hold on to it. But that night, something unfamiliar settled into the small room she shared with Thabo. It was not comfort, not yet, and certainly not security. It was something quieter, something more cautious. It was the beginning of change. After the doctor left, leaving behind carefully arranged medication and instructions spoken with a calm certainty Dineo had never encountered before, the room fell into a stillness that felt almost sacred. Thabo's breathing, though still weak, had begun to stabilize. The tension in his chest had eased just enough to allow his body to rest without fighting every breath. Dineo sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if she needed to confirm that he was truly there, that this moment was real, not something her mind had created out of desperation. She watched him closely, memorizing the rhythm of his breathing, the way his face relaxed slightly with each passing minute. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't counting breaths in fear. She was watching them in relief. Behind her, Kagiso remained where he had been standing, his presence steady but unobtrusive. He did not move around the room, did not inspect anything, did not offer unnecessary words. He simply stayed, giving space without withdrawing entirely, allowing Dineo to exist in that moment without pressure. Eventually, she looked up. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. Kagiso shook his head slightly. "You don't have to." "I do," she replied, her voice firmer now, though still soft. "People don't do things like this for nothing." He met her gaze. "I told you already," he said. "Not everything needs to be a transaction." Dineo held his eyes for a moment, then looked away again. "That's easy to say when you have everything," she murmured. Kagiso didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped a little closer. Not too close, just enough to shift the distance between them. "Do you think I've always had everything?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She looked at him again more carefully this time. "I don't know," she admitted. Kagiso gave a small nod. "Exactly." The answer wasn't defensive. It wasn't revealing either. It simply existed, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, Dineo didn't push further. Because she sensed something. Not mystery, not distance, but depth. Something he wasn't ready to explain. And something she wasn't ready to ask about. The silence between them shifted again, softer now. After a while, Kagiso glanced toward the door. "I should go," he said. Dineo felt something tighten slightly in her chest. Not fear, not dependence, but awareness. Because once he left, the reality of everything would return fully. "Still," she nodded. "Okay." Kagiso paused, then reached into his pocket once more. This time he placed something on the small wooden table near the wall. Dineo's eyes followed the movement immediately. Money. Not a small amount. Not something she could ignore. Her body stiffened slightly. "No," she said quickly, standing up. "I can't take that." Kagiso didn't turn back immediately. "It's not charity," he said. "It feels like it. It's support." She shook her head. "I didn't agree to that." Kagiso finally turned to face her again. "And I didn't agree to watch you struggle when I can help." The words weren't forceful, but they carried weight. Dineo stepped closer to the table, looking at the money as if it were something dangerous. "If I take this," she said slowly, "then I owe you." Kagiso studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said. "If you take this, then you survive long enough to decide what you want to owe anyone." The distinction settled heavily, because it was different. Not obligation, not control. Choice. Dineo's fingers curled slightly at her sides. She didn't reach for the money, but she didn't push it away either. Kagiso noticed. "And that was enough. I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "For what, to check on him?" He nodded toward Thabo. "And you?" Dineo hesitated. Then, "Okay." The word came quietly, but it was real. Kagiso gave a final nod, then turned and stepped out of the room. This time, when the door closed behind him, the sound felt different. Not like something ending, but like something continuing. Dineo stood there for a moment, staring at the table, at the money, at what it represented. Not wealth, not power, but possibility. Slowly she walked over. Her hand hovered above it, then lowered. Not to take it immediately, but to touch it, to confirm it was real. Her chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Relief. She exhaled slowly, then finally gathered the money and placed it carefully into her bag. Not as something taken, but as something accepted. There was a difference. She returned to Thabo's side. He was asleep now, peacefully, for the first time in days. Dineo sat beside him again, her posture softer, her shoulders no longer carrying the same unbearable weight. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know who Kagiso truly was. She didn't know why he had chosen to step into her life at that exact moment. But she knew this. Something had changed, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she wasn't standing alone in the middle of it. The next morning came differently. Not easier, but lighter. Dineo woke to the sound of Thabo, breathing steadily beside her. And that alone was enough to shift the way the day began. She prepared water, adjusted his blanket, followed the doctor's instructions carefully, her movements more confident now. Not because she suddenly had all the answers, but because she had direction. And direction made a difference. After making sure Thabo was comfortable, she stepped outside. The township looked the same. Nothing had changed there. But she had. She walked with more purpose, now her mind clearer, her steps more certain. Because now she wasn't just surviving the day. She was beginning to rebuild it. And somewhere in the city, a man named Kagiso Dlamini had already begun setting things in motion that Dineo could not yet see. Because help, when it was real, didn't stop at a single moment. It continued, quietly, consistently, until it changed everything. The following days did not unfold like a miracle. They unfolded like work. Slow, deliberate, sometimes uncertain work, the kind that required patience, consistency, and a willingness to trust something that still felt unfamiliar. For Dineo, nothing changed overnight. The walls of her small home did not suddenly become stronger. The streets outside did not become kinder, and the weight of her past did not simply disappear because help had arrived. But something fundamental had shifted. There was structure now, there was movement, and perhaps most importantly, there was truth waiting to surface. Kagiso did not return with grand gestures. He came quietly, just as he had the first night, checking on Thabo, speaking with the doctor, ensuring that the treatment continued exactly as it should. He never stayed longer than necessary, never imposed himself into their space, never asked questions that felt intrusive. Instead, he observed, listened, and acted only where it mattered. And Dineo began to notice something else. Every time Kagiso spoke to someone on the phone, something happened. Not eventually, not after delay, immediately. Appointments were confirmed, medication arrived, follow-ups were arranged with a level of precision she had never experienced before. There were no long waits, no dismissive attitudes, no barriers that forced her to beg for attention. It didn't feel normal, because it wasn't. One afternoon, while Thabo slept more peacefully than he had in weeks, Dineo stepped outside to catch a moment of air. The heat had softened the sky, stretching wide above the township, carrying the distant sounds of life, continuing as it always had. Kagiso stood a few steps away, speaking quietly on his phone. "I want everything reviewed again," he was saying. "Every detail. Don't assume anything." His tone was calm, but firm, different from how he spoke to her. Dineo watched him carefully, and for the first time, she allowed herself to think what she had been avoiding. Who is he? Because whatever he was doing now, it wasn't ordinary. He ended the call and turned slightly, noticing her presence immediately. You should rest, he said. Dineo shook her head. I've rested enough. Kagiso studied her for a moment. You're not used to resting, are you? She gave a faint, almost amused breath. No. He nodded as if that confirmed something he already knew. There was a pause. Then what were you talking about? She asked. Kagiso didn't pretend not to understand. Your case, he said. Dineo's expression tightened slightly. I told you. It doesn't matter anymore. Yes, he replied. It does. She looked away. They already decided. And they were wrong. The certainty in his voice made her turn back. You don't know that, she said. Kagiso held her gaze. I do. How he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. Then he tapped the screen once and turned it toward her. Because of this, Dineo stepped closer, slowly her eyes focusing on the screen. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. A room, familiar. Then her breath caught. Naledi's room. The footage was from a security camera positioned high enough to capture most of the space without being obvious. The timestamp marked the same night everything had happened. Dineo's heart began to pound. She watched. Naledi entered the room, alone, calm, unhurried. She walked to the dresser, picked up the bracelet, looked at it for a moment, then turned, and moved toward the door. But instead of leaving, she paused, looked around briefly, then reached into her bag, pulled out something small. Dineo leaned closer, her chest tightening. Naledi opened the bag and placed the bracelet inside. Not on the dresser, not hidden in the room, but, clearly, deliberately into someone else's belongings. The timestamp shifted. Minutes later, Dineo herself entered the room, carrying the tray, unaware, uninvolved, and then she left. The footage ended. Dineo stepped back slowly, her hands trembling, her mind struggling to catch up with what she had just seen. She put it there, Dineo whispered. Kagiso nodded. Yes, the word landed like something heavy finally settling into place. Not confusion, not doubt. Truth, clear, undeniable. Dineo's breath became uneven. I told them, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I told them I didn't do it. I know, but they didn't listen. Kagiso's expression remained steady. They didn't want to. The difference mattered. Because not listening was one thing. Choosing not to listen was something else entirely. Dineo turned away her hand, moving to her forehead as if trying to steady herself. For days she had carried the weight of that accusation. Not because she believed it, but because no one had given her the chance to prove otherwise. And now, here it was, proof, real, visible, too late to stop what had happened, but not too late to change what came next. What are you going to do with it? She asked quietly. Kagiso stepped closer. That depends on you. She frowned slightly. On me? Yes. Dineo turned to face him again. I don't understand. Kagiso held her gaze. I can expose them, he said, publicly, legally, completely. The words were calm, but powerful. They will lose everything, he added. Dineo's heart skipped slightly. The image formed instantly. Madame Zanele, Naledi, the house, the power they held. Gone, just like that. Because of this, because of the truth. They deserve it, Kagiso said. Dineo didn't respond immediately, because while part of her agreed, another part hesitated. Not because they deserved mercy, but because she understood something deeper. Pain didn't always heal through destruction, and justice was not always the same as revenge. What do you want? Kagiso asked. The question came quietly, but it carried more weight than anything else. Dineo looked down briefly, then back at the screen, then at him. I want, she began. Her voice faltered. She swallowed. I want them to know what they did. Kagiso nodded slowly. and I want my name back." The words were simple, but they held everything: her dignity, her truth, her identity, taken in a moment, now waiting to be restored. Kagiso studied her carefully, then gave a small nod. "Then that's what we'll do. No more, no less." Dineo exhaled slowly. The tension in her chest shifted again. Not gone, but different, because now the story was no longer frozen at the moment she was thrown out. It was moving again, toward something, toward resolution, toward justice. And for the first time since that night, Dineo didn't feel like she was standing outside the door anymore. She felt like she was about to walk back through it, not as the girl who had been accused, but as someone who carried the truth with her. And this time they would have to listen. The day Dineo returned to the Moenas mansion did not feel like a return. It felt like stepping into a place that no longer had the same power over her. The gates stood exactly as they had before, tall, polished, intimidating in their quiet display of wealth. But something inside Dineo had shifted so deeply that the fear they once held over her had lost its grip. She stood just outside for a moment, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of the walls, the security posts, the long driveway that had once felt like a boundary she could never cross with dignity. Now she was walking in by choice, not as a servant, not as someone being summoned, but as someone who had come back with truth in her hands. Beside her, Kagiso remained calm, his presence steady as always, though today there was something different about him. He was no longer blending into the background, no longer allowing himself to appear ordinary. His posture carried authority more openly. Now his silence no longer just observation, but control. He had arranged this, every detail, every step. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Dineo didn't answer immediately. She looked ahead again, her breath steady but deep. Her mind briefly revisiting the memory of that night, the accusations, the voices, the moment she had been pulled out of this very place, as if she had no value. Then she nodded. Yes, the gates opened, not slowly, not reluctantly, immediately, as if someone inside already knew exactly who was arriving. That alone said more than words ever could. They walked in together. The driveway felt longer this time, not because of distance, but because of what it carried. Every step forward brought back fragments of memory, echoes of a version of herself that had once moved carefully, silently, trying not to be seen. But today, she did not lower her eyes. She did not shrink. She walked straight, steady, present. Inside the house was already waiting. Madame Zanelle stood near the center of the main living area, her posture as composed as ever, though her expression carried a tightness that hadn't been there before. Naledi stood beside her, arms crossed, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharper, more alert. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. A few other people were present as well, staff, a legal advisor, and two men Dineo did not recognize, dressed in a way that suggested they were not part of the household. Witnesses, observers, people who would ensure that what happened next would not be ignored. Dineo stopped a few steps inside. The space felt the same, but she didn't. Why is she here? Naledi's voice cut through the air, first sharper than before, lacking the casual cruelty she had once used so easily. Now there was tension behind it. Madame Zanelle didn't speak immediately. Her eyes moved from Dineo to Kagiso, and in that moment, recognition flickered. Not complete, but enough. You didn't come alone, she said slowly. Kagiso stepped slightly forward, positioning himself beside Dineo, not in front of her, not shielding her but standing with her. No, he said calmly, she didn't. Madame Zanelle's gaze sharpened. And you are? Kagiso didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he turned slightly toward one of the men standing near the side. Play it. The man nodded. A tablet was activated. The room shifted, attention redirected, and then the footage began. At first, no one spoke. Naledi's expression didn't change immediately. Madame Zanelle remained still, but as the video continued, frame by frame, moment by moment, the air in the room tightened. Naledi entering the room, Naledi holding the bracelet, Naledi placing it into the bag. Clear, undeniable, impossible to misinterpret. Dineo watched it again, not because she needed to, but because this time she was not watching it alone. This time they were watching with her. The footage ended. Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. Naledi's face had changed, not dramatically, but enough. Her arms dropped slowly to her sides. "That doesn't prove anything," she said quickly. The words came fast, too fast. "It could be edited. Anyone could. It's original footage," the man with the tablet said calmly. "Time-stamped, verified." Naledi's voice faltered slightly. She looked at her mother. Madame Zanelle remained still, but her eyes were no longer calm. They were calculating, searching, trying to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding," she said finally, her tone measured, careful. "There must be context we are missing." Dineo felt something rise inside her. Not anger, not rage, something steadier, something stronger. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The room turned toward her. "This is not a misunderstanding," she continued. For the first time since she had entered the house, she stepped forward. Not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with intention. "You accused me," she said, looking directly at Madame Zanelle now. "You didn't ask. You didn't listen. You decided." Her voice didn't shake. "Not this time. You called me a thief." The word landed in the room, heavy, clear, "and you threw me out like I didn't matter." Silence held. No one interrupted, because this time they couldn't. Dineo turned slightly, her gaze moving toward Naledi. "You knew I didn't take it." Naledi didn't respond, her eyes shifted away. "That night," Dineo continued, "I begged you to listen to me." Her voice softened slightly, not weaker but deeper. "You didn't." A pause. "Then I lost everything. Because of that." The words settled into the space, filling it in a way nothing else had. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true. Kagiso watched her quietly. He didn't step in, didn't speak, because this moment belonged to her. Madame Zanelle exhaled slowly, her composure beginning to crack in subtle ways. "If this is true," she said carefully, "then mistakes were made." Dineo's eyes didn't leave hers. "Mistakes," she repeated. The word felt smaller now. Too small. Naledi finally spoke again, her voice lower this time. "I didn't think it would go this far." Dineo looked at her. "You didn't think at all." The truth cut deeper than accusation. Naledi had no answer for that. The room remained still. Then Kagiso stepped forward. And this time, he did not remain quiet. "This is no longer internal," he said calmly. "This is now a legal matter." Madame Zanelle's eyes snapped toward him. "Who do you think you are to Kagiso Dlamini?" The name landed, and this time recognition was immediate, complete. The room shifted instantly, not subtly, not gradually, sharply, because that name carried weight, power, influence, the kind that did not need explanation. Madame Zanelle's posture changed, not fully, but enough. Naledi's expression tightened further, and for the first time, the balance of power in the room was no longer where it had always been. It had shifted, completely. Dineo felt it, not in the way they looked at Kagiso, but in the way they now looked at her. Because suddenly she was no longer someone they could dismiss, no longer someone they could silence, no longer someone they could remove. She was someone who had come back, with truth, with presence, with a voice they could not ignore. And this time everything was different. What followed did not explode into chaos. It unfolded slowly, like something inevitable, finally catching up with people who had always believed they could outrun consequence. The silence that settled after Kagiso spoke his name was not empty. It was heavy with recognition, with recalculation, with the quiet understanding that the situation had moved beyond control. For years, Madame Zanelle had built her world on certainty, on power that was rarely questioned, on decisions that were rarely challenged, on a structure where people like Dineo existed only within the limits she defined for them. But now those limits had broken, not loudly, not violently, but completely. Dineo could see it in the way Madame Zanelle's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, in the way her posture remained composed but no longer effortless. She was holding herself together now, not out of habit but out of necessity. "You should have handled this differently," Madame Zanelle said finally, her voice measured, attempting to regain the ground that was slipping beneath her. "Bringing this here, making it public. It damages everyone involved." The words were carefully chosen, controlled, but they revealed something deeper. Concern, not for truth, not for justice, but for reputation. Dineo felt something shift inside her again. Not anger, but clarity. "For you," she said quietly. The room turned toward her again. "This damages you." She continued, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "Not me." The distinction mattered, and this time, no one could blur it. Naledi stepped forward slightly, her composure thinning at the edges. "You're acting like you're the only one affected," she said, her tone defensive now. "Do you have any idea what this could do to us?" Dineo looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not superiority, not control, fear. "You should have thought about that before," Dineo replied. The words were not sharp. They didn't need to be. Because truth, when spoken without hesitation, didn't require force. Naledi opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, because there was nothing left to defend. The footage had already said everything. The room remained still, but the tension had shifted direction. It no longer pressed down on Dineo. It had moved, settling now around those who had once stood untouched by it. Kagiso stepped forward again, his presence quiet but decisive. "This will proceed legally," he said. "The evidence has already been submitted." Madame Zanelle's eyes flickered. "You're escalating this unnecessarily." "No," Kagiso replied calmly. "I'm correcting what should have been handled properly the first time." There was no aggression in his tone, only certainty, and certainty in that moment was more powerful than anger could have ever been. Dineo stood quietly beside him, listening but no longer feeling like she was being carried through something she didn't control. This wasn't his fight anymore. It was hers, and she was standing in it, fully, present, aware. "I don't want revenge," she said suddenly. The words shifted the room again. Kagiso glanced at her briefly. Madame Zanelle looked at her more carefully now. Naledi's expression changed slightly, confused slightly, hopeful, as if she was searching for something she could use. Dineo continued. "I don't want to destroy you," she said, her voice calm, grounded. "That won't fix anything." A small pause. Then, "But I won't walk away like nothing happened." The balance held. Firm, clear. "What do you want, then?" Madame Zanelle asked. The question was no longer dismissive. It was careful, because now it mattered. Dineo took a breath, not to steady herself, but to choose her words. "I want the truth acknowledged," she said, publicly. Naledi's shoulders stiffened. Madame Zanelle remained still. "I want it known that I didn't steal anything," Dineo continued, "that I was falsely accused, that I was treated unfairly." Each sentence landed with precision, not emotional, not exaggerated, just clear, "and I want an apology." The last word hung in the air, simple, but heavy, because apology in that house had never been something given freely. Madame Zanelle's lips pressed together slightly. "That can be arranged privately," she said. Dineo shook her head. "No." The word came gently, but firmly. The accusation wasn't private. Silence followed, because again there was no argument against that. Naledi looked down briefly, her fingers curling slightly at her sides. "I didn't think," she began, then stopped, because finishing that sentence would not undo anything, would not change anything. Dineo watched her, and in that moment she realized something important. Naledi was not sorry because of what she had done. She was sorry because of what it had become, and those were not the same thing. Kagiso spoke again, his tone steady. "The statement will be issued today," he said, "and compensation will be discussed formally." Madame Zanelle's head lifted slightly. "Compensation for damages," Kagiso replied. The word settled differently. "Because it carried consequence, real, structured, enforceable." "This is excessive," Madame Zanelle said. "No," Kagiso said quietly. "This is proportional." The tension sharpened briefly, then fell, because even Madame Zanelle knew this was no longer something she could control. Not fully. Not anymore. Dineo stood there listening, but her mind had shifted beyond the room now, beyond the conversation, beyond the immediate outcome, because something deeper had already happened. She had come back, not to beg, not to explain, but to be seen, and she had been. The same people who had once dismissed her without hesitation now stood in front of her, unable to ignore her presence, unable to silence her voice, unable to rewrite the truth to fit their convenience. That was the real shift. The rest was process. Madame Zanelle exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "We will handle this," she said. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was acceptance, and that mattered. Naledi remained quiet, her eyes no longer sharp, no longer dismissive, just uncertain. Dineo looked at her one last time, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something more final, understanding, because in the end what had been broken could not simply return to what it was. Not for Naledi, not for Madame Zanelle, and not for her. Kagiso stepped back slightly, signaling that the moment was closing. "Let's go," he said quietly. Dineo nodded. She didn't look around again, didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. She turned and walked out, not the way she had been forced out before, not pulled, not pushed, but walking, by choice, with dignity, with her head held steady. And as the doors closed behind her once again, the sound was no longer an ending. It was a separation. From what she had been, from what she had endured, from a place that no longer had power over her life. Outside the air felt different, lighter, clearer. Not because everything was finished, but because the truth had finally been spoken. And once truth is spoken, it cannot be undone. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded with a quiet intensity, the kind that does not need noise to prove its weight. News travels differently, depending on what it carries, and this time it carried truth, clear, documented, impossible to ignore. What had once been a private accusation, whispered inside a mansion, became a public correction that moved through Johannesburg with a steady, undeniable force. The statement was released exactly as Kagiso had said it would be. It did not exaggerate. It did not dramatize. It simply told the truth. That Dineo had been falsely accused, that evidence had been manipulated, that her dismissal had been unjust, that an apology was owed. And for the first time since that night, her name was no longer attached to a lie. It was attached to truth. Dineo did not read the statement immediately. When Kagiso first told her it had been published, she felt something inside her hesitate. Not fear, not doubt, but something quieter. A part of her that had grown used to being unseen now had to adjust to being acknowledged, and that shift was not as easy as it sounded. Recognition, even when deserved, still required courage to face. She sat beside Thabo that afternoon, the soft light of the room settling around them, his breathing steady, his strength slowly returning in ways she could finally begin to trust. The doctor had visited again that morning and spoken with a confidence that had once felt unreachable. Progress, he had said. Not complete recovery, but progress. That word had begun to carry meaning again. "You should read it," Thabo said gently, watching her. Dineo looked down at the phone in her hand. I know, but she hadn't yet, because reading it would make everything real in a way she hadn't fully allowed herself to accept. Thabo smiled faintly. "You've been waiting for this." Dineo let out a slow breath. "I thought I was." A small silence followed. "Then maybe you're just not used to people admitting they were wrong," Thabo said. She looked at him and realized he was right. Slowly, she unlocked the phone, opened the statement, and read. The words were simple, clear, public, no denial, no distortion, no way to misinterpret. An apology from Madame Zanele Mokoena, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a direct statement clearing Dineo's name. Dineo read it once, then again, then a third time. Each time the weight of it settled differently, not like relief rushing in all at once, but like something steady replacing something that had been broken. Her name, restored, her truth, recognized, not in private, not behind closed doors, but openly, where it mattered. She lowered the phone, slowly, her eyes remaining on the screen for a moment longer, before she looked up. "I didn't think it would feel like this," she said quietly. "What did you expect?" Thabo asked. Dineo thought for a moment. "I thought it would fix everything." Thabo tilted his head slightly. "Doesn't it?" She shook her head. "It fixes the lie," she said, "but it doesn't erase what happened." The honesty of that settled between them, because healing was not the same as reversal, but even so, something had changed, and that mattered. Later that evening, Dineo stepped outside the air cooler, now the sky stretching wide above her in shades of fading light. The township moved as it always did, people talking, children running life, continuing without pause. But she felt different within it. Not separate, not above, just steadier. Kagiso arrived not long after. As always, quiet, measured, present without disruption. "You saw it." He said more a statement than a question. Dineo nodded. "I did," and she paused. Then it helped. The words were simple, but they carried truth. Kagiso studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "That's enough." They stood in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Until, "Why didn't you tell me?" Dineo asked. Kagiso glanced at her. "Tell you what? Who you are?" The question had been waiting. Now it had surfaced. Kagiso didn't look away. "I didn't think it mattered." Dineo let out a small breath. It mattered today. He considered that, then nodded slightly. "Yes." She turned to face him more fully. "You're not just someone who helps people on the street. No. And you knew exactly what you were doing from the beginning." "Yes." Dineo held his gaze. "Then why me?" The question came again, but this time deeper. Not just curiosity, understanding. Kagiso took a moment before answering. "Because you didn't change," he said. She frowned slightly. "I lost everything." "Yes," he replied, "but you didn't lose who you are." The words landed quietly, but they stayed. "You were treated unfairly," he continued. "You were pushed out, left with nothing, and still you gave something to someone else." Dineo looked away briefly. "That was just—" She stopped, because she didn't have a word for it. It wasn't just anything Kagiso said. Silence followed. "Then I've seen people with far more do far less," he added. Dineo let out a slow breath. "And that made you decide to do all of this?" Kagiso shook his head slightly. It made me pay attention. The distinction mattered, because attention was what had led to everything else. They stood there for a while longer, the evening settling deeper around them. Then Kagiso spoke again. "There's something else," he said. Dineo looked at him. "What a position," he said. "Work." Her expression shifted immediately. "What kind of work? Not as a maid." The answer came clearly. Dineo's chest tightened slightly. Then what Kagiso met her gaze. "A role in one of my community programs," he said. "Helping women who are in situations like yours. Legal support, housing assistance, job placement." Dineo blinked. "Processing. You want me to do that. I want you to be part of it." "Why?" "Because you understand it," he said. "Not from the outside, from inside it." Dineo looked down briefly, her mind moving quickly. This wasn't charity. This wasn't survival. This was something else, something bigger. "I don't know if I can do that," she said honestly. Kagiso nodded. "You don't have to decide now." She looked back at him. "And if I say no, then you say no. No pressure, no expectation. Just choice." Again. Dineo exhaled slowly. "I'll think about it." Kagiso gave a small nod. "That's enough." The night grew quieter around them, and for the first time since everything had begun, Dineo felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Not relief, not safety, but direction. Because now her story was no longer just about what had been done to her. It was about what she would do next. The decision did not come in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, shaped by quiet reflections, by small changes that began to take root in Dineo's daily life, and by the growing awareness that the path ahead of her no longer looked like the one she had been forced to walk before. For the first time in years, her mornings were no longer driven by urgency alone. She still woke early. Habit does not disappear overnight. But the weight that used to press against her chest the moment she opened her eyes had begun to ease. Thabo's condition continued to improve steadily under proper care. His breathing no longer a constant source of fear. His strength returning in visible ways that felt almost unfamiliar to witness. He laughed more now, softly at first, then more freely. And every time he did it reminded Dineo of something she had nearly forgotten, that life was not meant to be endured endlessly. It was meant to be lived. Still, the question Kagiso had left her with remained, not as pressure, but as possibility. She had spent days thinking about it, turning it over in her mind while going through the new rhythm of her life. The idea of stepping into something larger than her own survival felt both empowering and overwhelming. She had never seen herself as someone who could guide others, someone who could stand in front of people and offer direction. She had only ever been the one trying to find it. But something had changed, not in what she knew, but in what she had lived through. And experience, she was beginning to understand, carried a kind of knowledge that no instruction ever could. One afternoon, as she sat beside Thabo while he worked through a small reading exercise given to him by the visiting nurse, she watched him struggle briefly with a sentence. Before correcting himself, determination flickering across his face. "You're getting better," she said. He smiled. "So are you." Dineo frowned slightly. "At what?" "At believing things can change," he replied simply. The answer lingered. Because it was true. She had spent so long expecting nothing that even the smallest shift had felt unfamiliar. But now she was standing in the middle of something she had never imagined, a life that was not defined entirely by loss, not shaped only by what had been taken from her, but influenced by what she chose to do next. That evening, when Kagiso returned, he found her waiting outside. Not uncertain, not hesitant, but ready. "I've thought about it," she said. Kagiso nodded, his expression calm, giving her the space to continue. "I don't know everything," she added. "I don't have experience the way other people might." Kagiso didn't interrupt. "But I know what it feels like," she said. "To be ignored, to be blamed, to be left with nothing and expected to survive it anyway." Her voice remained steady, grounded, and if there are other people going through that. She paused, then met his gaze fully. "I don't want them to feel like they're alone." The words settled into the space between them. Clear, final. Kagiso gave a small nod. "That's enough." Dineo exhaled slowly. Not from tension, but from release. Because the decision once spoken no longer needed to be carried alone. The transition into her new role did not happen all at once. Kagiso did not place her in a position and expect her to immediately understand it. Instead, he introduced her gradually, allowing her to observe, to listen, to learn in a way that respected both her capability and her pace. The community program operated quietly but effectively, reaching people who had fallen through the cracks of systems that were supposed to protect them. Women who had been dismissed, displaced, or denied support stood at the center of its work, each carrying stories that echoed in different ways with Dineo's own. At first, she simply listened. She sat in rooms where others spoke about their experiences, about being removed from homes without notice, about being accused without evidence, about being silenced when they tried to speak. And as she listened, she realized something that both hurt and strengthened her at the same time. Her story was not rare, but her survival of it. That mattered. Slowly she began to speak, not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who understood the questions, and that made a difference. Because sometimes what people needed most was not a solution immediately placed in their hands, but the assurance that they were seen, heard, and not alone in what they were facing. Weeks passed, then months, and with each passing day, Dineo grew into something she had never imagined herself becoming. Not stronger in the way people often describe strength, not hardened, not distant, but steadier. More certain of her voice, more willing to stand in spaces that once would have intimidated her. She did not forget where she came from. She did not distance herself from it. Instead, she carried it with her and used it. Thabo continued to improve his health, stabilizing in ways that allowed him to begin thinking about things beyond survival. School became a possibility again. Future became something more than just a word, and every time Dineo saw him planning, imagining, hoping, she knew that everything she had endured had not been meaningless. One afternoon, months later, Dineo stood outside a modest building where the program had recently expanded its operations. The sign was simple, the space not extravagant, but it was functional, welcoming, and alive with purpose. Kagiso stood beside her, observing quietly. "You've changed this place," he said. Dineo shook her head slightly. "It was already here." "Yes," he replied. "But now it's different." She glanced at him. How he looked at the people moving in and out of the building, women speaking with staff, children waiting nearby, quiet conversations happening in corners that once held only uncertainty. "Now it feels like something people can walk into," he said. "Not something they have to fight to reach." Dineo looked back at the building, at the door, at the people stepping through it, and she understood. Because once she had been the one standing outside, not knowing if she would be allowed in, not knowing if anyone would listen. Now she was part of the reason the door remained open. And that was everything. She turned slightly toward Kagiso. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the help, not just for the opportunity, but for seeing something in her when she could not yet see it herself." Kagiso gave a small nod. "You did the rest." Dineo smiled faintly, not out of habit, not out of politeness, but because for the first time in a long time she felt something settle inside her that had nothing to do with survival, peace, not perfect, not permanent, but real. And as she stood there watching life move in ways she had once believed were out of reach, she understood something clearly. Her story had not ended the night she was thrown out of that mansion. It had only just begun.
Sometimes life breaks people in ways that seem impossible to repair. It takes away dignity, replaces truth with accusation, and leaves silence where voices once tried to be heard. But this story reminds us of something powerful, something real. Being knocked down does not define who you are. What defines you is what you choose to do when no one is watching, when nothing is guaranteed, when kindness feels like a risk instead of a strength. Dineo did not become who she was because life was fair to her. She became who she was because she chose not to lose herself in the middle of unfairness. And in the end, that choice did more than restore her life. It allowed her to restore others. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. What would you do in her place? Would you still choose kindness when it seems like the world has taken everything from you? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and how this story made you feel. And if you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, because sometimes a story can be the beginning of someone else's hope.